This video has been made possible thanks to CuriosityStream. If you live for learning things or enjoy a good documentary, CuriosityStream's YouTube channel is definitely worth your click. Check out their new custom series where they will take you through pivotal moments in the past, present, and potential future of a handful of key themes, tackling everything from surgery to food to hallucinogens. Past, present, future will help us understand the threads connecting yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But not only that, CuriosityStream is also launching other great content, like The Science of Sound, where music educator Marty Schwartz connects with neuroscientists, music therapists, and more to better understand the science behind the music. And all absolutely free, just a click here on YouTube. Go check out the full episode of Past, Present, Future, and subscribe to CuriosityStream for more of their brain-expanding content. You'll find all the information in the video description. For almost 2 decades, between 1955 and 1973, Japan grew at an annual rate of 9%. For the next 17 years, it grew at over 4%. So, by 1989, the country seemed ready to take over the world. In barely 3 decades, Japan had become a gigantic industrial and financial power. It was by far one of the richest countries on the planet. In addition, Japanese multinationals had become the major technological players of the moment. Televisions, VHS players, cameras, video game consoles. Japanese industry was setting the world's technological agenda. And not only that, between 1984 and 1989 alone, the Nikkei index multiplied by more than 3 times. At the same time that house prices kept setting new records. The Japanese had become rich. Really, really rich. In 1990, however, the balloon suddenly burst. The Japanese economy entered a deep economic, real estate, and financial crisis from which it has never fully escaped. And yes, today, Japan is still a developed country and a wealthy one, but things are totally different. Take a look.
Japanese yen hits 24-year low against dollar. Japan intervenes to prop up yen for the first time since 1998.
To give you an idea of what this very drawn-out crisis has really meant, we can take a look at what has happened to wages. When the 21st century began, the average wage in the United States and Japan was approximately the same. However, today, the average US wage is 2.5 times higher than the Japanese equivalent. And in fact, in real terms, that is, after adjusting for inflation, Japanese wages are lower today than they were in 1997. In other words, they are lower than they were 25 years ago. It is a decline that we can also see if we look at GDP. For example, if in 1990, Japan and Germany, taking into account the price difference, had roughly the same GDP per capita, today, the German nation's is 35% higher. Another example? Well, take the case of South Korea. In 1990, in per capita terms, and even after taking into account the price difference, the South Korean economy was just over 40% of the Japanese economy. Today, it has already surpassed it. But what could explain such an economic decline? Why has Japan's economy failed to recover in more than 30 years? What can we expect in the coming years? Hey there viewers, welcome to VisualPolitik. Let's get started.
The blot on the rising sun.
Japan remains a relatively wealthy country and also continues to be the world's largest creditor. To give you an idea, in net terms, that is, taking into account the difference between what it owes and what it is owed, Japan has about 3.5 trillion of net investments spread across the globe. The Japanese control factories, buildings, stocks, bonds, and all kinds of financial products. However, despite this, things are not going well there. In practice, wages have been frozen for years. Government debt is growing steadily, and the yen is becoming more and more fragile. In fact, according to the Bank for International Settlements, the yen is currently the weakest currency of any developed country. In recent years, its purchasing power has fallen alarmingly. This has made imports more and more expensive. In addition, when Japanese people travel abroad nowadays, they are shaking their heads at the high prices they find. For example, using the popular Big Mac Index, compiled by The Economist magazine, each Big Mac burger costs 70% more in New York than in Tokyo. So then, what is wrong with the Japanese economy? What kind of disease is it suffering from? Well, we can highlight 4 major factors, 4 major problems that explain the decline of the land of the rising sun. First, from a labour standpoint, Japan is still essentially the same country it was 30 to 40 years ago. There's a routine of long working hours, strict schedules, long commutes by public transport, and meagre vacations. In fact, this is perhaps what explains why it is the only country that has a word karoshi. That means death by overwork. For example, promotions and salary improvements depend essentially on seniority and not on achievements. Among other things, this means that the younger population is largely excluded from management and decision-making positions. In other words, people who are somewhat disconnected from the new technologies or new market trends are usually at the head of companies and various departments. And this way of proceeding also makes company changes very infrequent. Obviously, if the salary and the position depend on seniority, you're not going to hop off the ladder and start from scratch. Well, the question is whether it is quite possible that this stagnant culture is behind one of the great problems that this country is dragging along: low productivity. Yes, the Japanese work long hours, we all know that, but far from what we might think, they are terribly unproductive. For example, output per hour of work barely reaches 60% of output per hour in the United States, and is by far the lowest of all G7 countries. Even since 1990, its evolution has been substantially worse than that of a country like Spain. What's more, over the past 3 decades, Japanese companies themselves have moved many of their most productive factories overseas. And you know what? The problem with low productivity is not only that it limits income, but also that it forces people to work much longer hours, which is why Japan still has one of the highest rates of working hours in the world. And of course, in a country with so many demographic problems, where there are fewer and fewer workers available, this is a kind of economic millstone. In fact, this is the second major problem that we can highlight: demographics. Japan is by far the most elderly country in the world. Since 2011, its population has been shrinking year by year, and by 2036, those over 65 are expected to account for almost 35% of the population. And take note, because forecasts indicate that in a little more than 40 years, this country will lose more than 30% of its inhabitants. The Japanese population will fall from 126 million in 2020 to just over 87 million by 2065. This represents a demographic contraction unprecedented in all of human history. And of course, it is something that also affects the economy. Less population and an older population means fewer available workers, less consumption, less savings, and much more social spending. Then in third place, we have the connections with the outside world. You see, Japan is usually thought of as an economy that is very open to the world, but in reality, it is completely different. Japan is a relatively closed country in all fields, and it shows. For example, when your population is shrinking, exports may be the best alternative for maintaining the level of production. Of course, if fewer people buy from you at home, the logical thing to do is to look for customers from overseas, don't you think? Surprisingly, Japan is one of the developed countries in which exports have the least economic presence. Yes, enough with that cliche that the Japanese make a living by selling things to the rest of the world, because it's just not strictly true. In fact, despite having a clearly stagnant local market, Japanese companies are having a hard time looking abroad. You don't believe me? Take a look for yourself. The presence of exports in the economy is one of the smallest, and it's not just about trade. As we've seen here on VisualPolitik in a past video, Japan is also one of the countries with the lowest foreign direct investment in the world. It is just over 4% of its GDP. And do you know what the average of developed countries is? No less than 44%, 11 times more. Of course, this is something that limits productivity, competition, innovation, etc, etc, etc. Then, by the same token, Japan is also the most immigration-restricted developed country on the planet. Only 2.3% of its population is foreign-born. So, you see, whether in terms of trade, investment, or immigration, this is probably the most isolated country of all the developed economies. In a way, Japan is not only an island geographically, but also economically, and that's a gigantic problem. Finally, the fourth major problem is that the country has been pursuing the same policies for 30 years. Policies that basically boil down to two ideas: more monetary stimulus and more fiscal stimulus. For example, the Central Bank of Japan is currently the only central bank in the world to keep interest rates in negative territory, at negative 0.10%. This is largely what explains the yen's plunge that we saw at the beginning of this video. On the other hand, in an attempt to escape the crisis, the government has accumulated the highest gross debt in the world. We're talking about a public debt equivalent amounts to more than 230% of GDP. Although, as we told you on Visual Economic, there is a catch. But what is undeniable is that the state has been accumulating public deficits year after year as if there were no tomorrow. Now, wait a minute, does this mean that this country is doomed to go from bad to worse? Well, the truth is that more and more analysts are betting on the opposite, at least in financial terms. Why? Well, let's take a look.
A discounted country?
Over the last 30 years, the Japanese stock market has been one of the worst performers in the world. And if we add to this the fall in the value of the yen, what we find is one of the cheapest countries in the entire developed world. On the Tokyo Stock Exchange, many companies are already trading at little more than the cash accumulated on their balance sheets. And that is precisely why many analysts say that the discount is gradually becoming so large that the country could suddenly become a real opportunity, especially since the country is trying to solve many of its problems. For example, it is pushing for free trade agreements, and in fact has become the leader of the CPTPP, one of the most important free trade agreements worldwide and certainly the trending organization. Everyone wants to join it, from the UK to the People's Republic of China. Well, it is Japan that is piloting it. In addition, as we've already told you, the Kishida government has recently promoted a plan to boost nuclear energy again in order to obtain large amounts of energy and cheap hydrogen. Take note of this because during recent years, the energy bill has been one of the country's major problems. The government is also favoring the improvement of corporate governance in companies, the integration of women in the professional world, and is facilitating the arrival of both foreign investment and immigrants. And if we add to all this the fact that the country has gained a lot of competitiveness with falling wages and prices, and that it is one of the world's fastest growing areas, then I think that we can all see the opportunity it represents. Of course, the same could have been said 10 years ago. And besides, as we already told you, Kishida's plans also take into account the reformulation of Japanese capitalism by doping it with even more public spending and more interventionism. Those things can't end well, but it is true that basically Japan is very cheap. So for the moment, the question is over to you. Do you think Japan will manage to escape its never-ending crisis, and could it become an opportunity for investment? Leave us your thoughts in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, see you next time.